Hello and welcome back. It's time for another course of Composition 2 with Mr. Fowler. This is for my 3004 section for our Thursday meeting this week. I'm so happy that you're able to join me here today because we're going to start our conversation about the first half of Chapter 5 of our text, The Princess Bride. Now, Chapter 5 is one of the longest chapters that we've encountered so far. And consequently, I've divided the reading up into separate sections, at least 3 separate sections, I believe. So we're going to take a look at the first of those 3 sections today. As I've said before in previous courses, the video feed tends to be a little bit smoother if I 86 the visual. So you'll probably just hear my voice for most of the lessons for today. But let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to stop my camera. I'm going to stop the video here. And then I'm going to share this PowerPoint. Now let's go ahead and start the slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so for today's session, number 13, we of course have a little bit of a preview and review, as we do for each and every session. So at the top of the hour, after I'm done with our preview, I'll go back and revisit some of the content from chapters 3 and 4, which we discussed on Tuesday. Then, of course, we'll have a brief video lecture, which should take about 40 minutes, maybe a little bit less, covering Chapter 5, Part 1, which is the material that you'll find roughly from pages 89 to 110. Then, I want to have a brief time for a Q&A, so that when you're watching this, if you are still available or if you are able to Zoom in and ask me some questions on Thursday, I'll try to set up some time where I'm available. Of course, you can always email me, but I want to address a few questions and answer some of the issues that have come up in regard to the ad analysis. Then I will stop the class about 15 minutes shy of our normal run time. We go for about 75 minutes per session, Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I'm going to leave that last 15 minutes free for you all as a way to help you balance out your schedules and attend to some of the other outside issues and concerns that deal with this course. Those being specifically the weekly discussion questions in the forum that you're responsible for. Lastly, as part of our preview, I just want to announce one reminder, and we'll close the session for today with that same reminder. But that final draft of the ad analysis is coming due this Friday, around or before 11:59 p.m. Now, you can always turn the drafts in early if you wish to do so, but you may also have until the end of the day on Friday if you feel like you truly need the time to budget for that project. Okay, let's move on now with our review of chapters 3 and 4 of The Princess Bride. Okay, so when we last checked in with what was going on, chapter 3, The Courtship, follows up our introduction to the villain's main novel, Humperdinck. Of course, we can see here in this example photograph, he has Queen Bella, his supposedly evil stepmother, over to his left, and over to his right. And wait, I'm transposing the image. Okay, so it would be, I was correct, Queen Bella on his left and Count Rugen on his right, which is appropriate because after all, Count Rugen is his right-hand man. Queen Bella got up a scheme to introduce Humperdinck to a princess from Gilder, the neighboring kingdom with which Florin, the setting of our story, had been at war. Now, as a consequence of going to war with Gilder for so many years, the countries, we're told, had been able to actually sustain their economies by going to war and sometimes collaborating in the art of thievery. But upon meeting the, how would you say that, Gilderian, maybe? Let's go with Gilderian. Upon meeting the Gilderian princess Narina, he discovers through a happenstance that she's bald. And he says, I'm not going to marry any bald princess. That would be bad for me. Again, his ego is in direct danger of being harmed. So he must find a wife, or must find a someone to bear him an heir at least, who is acceptable, who is physically beautiful. He wants somebody who, as he says, when they look at her, they think, wow, I must be some kind of fella. And Count Rugen, as per usual, is the man on the scene, and he has a suggestion. The suggestion, of course, is Buttercup. So the fourth chapter reveals the series of preparations that Buttercup must endure in order to become a really effective royal bride to be, or a betrothed, I guess you'd say. Humperdinck and Rugen quickly run into a major problem. Specifically, they know that Buttercup is a milkmaid, a commoner. And as the prince of Florin, Humperdinck is unable to marry her. So they come up with a solution. They name Buttercup as Princess of Hammersmith, which is, according to the text, quote, a lump of land associated or attached to King Lotherin's holdings. King Lotharin, of course, just as a quick end run, to remind us of who's who, is the current King of Florin and Humperdinck's father. We assume he's had some kind of malady, or he's been stricken by some health crisis, because he's only able to mumble. And it's up to Queen Bella to correctly interpret the king's wishes. So Buttercup, we're told, spends the next 3 years learning the various courtly manners of high society in preparation for her nuptials. All right, that leads us to today's new material, Chapter 5, the announcement. So the chapter picks up about 3 years later, and we're told that Buttercup is now a radiant 21-year-old, as opposed to the more dour 18-year-old mourner. Her wedding to Prince Humperdinck is to coincide with the 500th anniversary of the country, of the kingdom, I guess I should say, of Florin. And they make a formal announcement that this is all going to take place. So, of course, the villagers from all around Florin flock to the site because they want to get a glimpse of this princess. After all, according to the text, in the events leading up to Buttercup's selection as the princess bride, her physical beauty had been known kind of the world over, as the text points out. But specifically, there had been many people, mostly men, who had come from far and wide to consider her beauty prior to her selection as the princess bride by Humperdinck. Of course, one of these people was the nefarious Count Rugen himself. But there's another issue at stake here. Because the prince is going to marry, there are some fears that perhaps King Lotharin may be ill. There are even some exaggerations that he may have already died, which has given rise to Prince Humperdinck's occasion for a wife. So we end up with a packed courtyard as Buttercup is introduced. When Buttercup appears, we're given another physical description of her, right? Specifically, we're talked about, the physical attributes that are discussed include a wrist that was a little bit more plump than the other. You know, there was some very subtle asymmetry that perhaps may have marred her pristine beauty. But these things, we're told, are easily attended to. And now she is in the full height and power of her beauty. But as such, she's also grown more accustomed to her position. And she begins to self-assert a little bit. Despite Humperdinck's insistence that the aristocracy of Florin does not walk amongst the commoners, she does exactly that, and pointing out that she has known more than a few commoners in her day, and she doesn't feel endangered by them. So this raises a couple of interesting points. Number one, it raises a point that not only has she begun to assert herself a little bit more in this role as the Princess Bride, but has designs on being a princess for the people, for the common people. Now, this is also potentially very dangerous, as we find out later in the chapter, because her over familiarity or over relaxation with the typical people does result ultimately in her being kidnapped later in the same chapter. There's a quote from the book about the occasion when she mingles among the citizenry that notes most of the people there would never forget that day. None of them, of course, had ever been so close to perfection, and the great majority of the people adored her instantly. We're also given an ominous note that the man in black is watching. Now, the man in black is not just another kidnapper. In fact, the man in black is so named for a very old character or old trope, which brings up our old friend Geoffrey Chaucer again. He wrote several books of poems, and the first was the Book of the Duchess. And in that text, we see a piece about a knight dressed in black who is mourning the loss of his lady love. But interestingly, this romantic piece has a frame device, and the frame device is a poet who is bedridden and cannot go to sleep. And to relax his mind, he indulges in a collection of old stories, including the story of Ceyx and Alony. And Ceyx and Alony is a story about a mariner who loses his wife at sea and mourns her absence. So other than the gender roles being transposed, this should probably sound familiar. Chaucer's poem begins again with the sleepless poet suffering from an unexplained sickness, who's been laying in his bed for 8 years. The poet dreams about stumbling upon a clearing where he finds a knight dressed in black composing a song for the death of his lady. The knight begins telling the story of his life, reporting that throughout his entire existence, he had served the idea of true love. But he waited for many years, setting his heart on a woman that would surpass all others. Again, this is direct text that is used and re-employed in The Princess Bride. The knight speaks of her surpassing beauty and the temperament that she possesses, and reveals that her name was Buttercup. Just joking. That would truly be inconceivable. But obviously, we can see that the tropes are work here, and we can see an intersection between Chaucer's original poem and its inspiration, or its features as one of the inspirations that inform The Princess Bride. So here's what I'm mostly interested in Chapter 5. Buttercup still enjoys some simple pleasures like horse riding, but she seems to be maturing as a character. While she says that, or rather, Goldman is the one who suggests that her thoughts perhaps are not the most expansive in the world, she's come to a level of comfort, or she's come to a level of confidence, or to discover this confidence, where she knows she's also not the dullest tool in the shed. Specifically, she has become aware of her feelings toward Humperdinck, and she asks a couple of questions. Is it wrong to marry without like, or is it wrong to marry someone if you're not truly in love with them? And even if you were not in love with them, or rather, even if you could marry them without love, would it be too late to change the course that she set herself upon? And she has a very specific set of answers for that. It's not wrong to marry without love, but if you do realize that that is part of what's going on in your relationship, can you change things? And she feels that the answer is yes. So we get a balance where she is becoming a little bit more of a nuanced character and a bit of more of a thinker, but I'm not sure how much of her naivete she has actually shed as of yet. She has to content herself, she says, with merely being the most beautiful woman in the world, and once she's married to Prince Humperdinck, being one of the richest and perhaps the most powerful. I thought that was high humor. So one of these great moments occurs on a page. What page? Oops, I just slipped away from me, pardon me. Page 93, just before the break. So if you have my edition in Chapter 5 on page 93, or I can just count the pages for you, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, about the 5th page in to Chapter 5. So it reads as such. It wasn't wrong to marry someone you didn't like. It just wasn't right either. If the whole world did it, that wouldn't be so great. What with everybody kind of grunting at everybody else as the years went by. And of course, this has to be somewhat of a reflection on the nature of Buttercup's parents' relationship. They're kind of always trying to one-up each other, but, and you would think that Buttercup would have come to this decision not lightly, but probably has a fair amount of experience with this kind of thought. But of course, not everybody did. So forget about that. The answer to the second question, if it was wrong to marry someone without actually loving them, was it too late to do anything about it, was even easier. She had given her word that she would marry, and that would have to be enough. So there's a certain a sense of obligation and honor in terms of the agreement that she has found herself a part of. True, Prince Humperdinck had told her quite honestly that if she had said no, he would have had to have disposed of in order to keep respect for the crown at its proper level. Still, she could have, had she so chosen, said no. Everyone had told her since she became a princess in training that she was very likely the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, she was going to be the richest and most powerful as well. Don't expect too much from life, Buttercup told herself as she rode along. Learn to be satisfied with what you have. So again, I keep waiting for the tide to turn where poor Buttercup gets at least a little bit of our respect as a readership. And even though this is a fairly contemporary novel, published in 1973 once again, I get the sense that, I don't know, that I want a little bit more out of Buttercup. But I have to ask two questions. Is Buttercup restrained as a character and restrained in terms of her character growth by the conventions of the high romantic story? Does she have to kind of give in to some of this naivete because the author is trying to maintain or perhaps even directly parody certain aspects of the high romantic adventure style? And number two, what about her parents? What happened to them? Did they go to see their daughter on the announcement day? I don't know. They just sort of disappear, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. So, of course, Buttercup goes out to ride one day and she encounters three men. One, a hunchback, or at least somebody who appears to be hunchbacked. We're later told that sources differ on whether or not Vizzini was actually a hunchback or whether or not he just had one leg that was shorter than another. But it's definitely a distinct physical marker. Fezzik, of course, is a giant, and Indigo is often described as blade thin. So she meets these very distinct characters, and they approach her just as they do in the famous film adaptation, under the auspices of being lost circus performers. And they quickly kidnap her by using a specific nerve pinch or other, which I think is kind of funny because I don't think the idea of a nerve pinch that could, force somebody into unconsciousness was invented before Star Trek. I might be wrong about that, but I thought that was particularly modern or contemporary, rather, kind of attack that they use. So what happens is, of course, Buttercup is rendered unconscious. She's kidnapped, and she doesn't awake until she finds herself encased in some sort of a sheet where she cannot see, but she can only hear, and she feels the gentle lapping of a boat as it rocks back and forth. She's kind of a savvy person here, or shows a degree of savvy, because she does have the mental fortitude to accept her situation, but not overly panic. She tries to gather information that she can by use of the limited senses that are available to her, specifically hearing in this case. She listens to what Vizzini's plan is, and she realizes that she's become embroiled in a plot to instigate war between Florin and Gilder. And the idea is that she will be murdered and her body left to be found by the prince on the Gilder frontier so that he will have justifiable reason to begin a war with her. Now, at this point, it's relatively unclear who has hatched this scheme, whether the kidnappers themselves are, thirsty for war, or whether or not it's another force who's operating behind the scenes, but we'll find out about that soon enough. And no spoilers if you've seen the film. It's obviously Prince Humperdinck. He, of course, has always been a little bit more of a warrior than a diplomat or even a lover. And his great accomplishments have to do with hunting. So he's someone who's eager for adventure and kind of a warmonger. And so he's willing to do just about anything, including sacrifice Buttercup to instigate said war. At some point, Buttercup is rendered unconscious again, despite, confronting her captors. And when she wakes the second time, she knows that she must escape. So she flings the cloth off of her and jumps deep down into the Florin Channel, or the Gilder Channel, depending on which side you associate with. And that's when her captors begin to show just how warped they really are. Earlier, they had collected a cup of blood to adorn her horse and the Gilder crest that they had appropriated. And it's now Vizzini who uses this blood to sort of chum the waters, because, of course, the Strait of Gildard is infested with sharks. Of course, they're called the Shrieking Eels in the film adaptation. But this gives us a moment of pause as our novelist, William Goldman, breaks in with a story from his youth about his father stopping the narrative as well and commenting on the fact that Buttercup doesn't get killed here. And of course, as a brave boy of 12 or 11, he says, of course I knew that wasn't a big deal. What do you think, that I'm a kid? But he does reveal that, of course, he's very frightened for her and for what will happen. So this is another really interesting side note and pause in the narrative structure. It's played for great humor in the film adaptation as well. So here I ask another question. What do you think about all of this? Does Buttercup's action in the face of danger suggest that she's become a more capable character in those 3 years that she spent in Florin? I think it might suggest that she's certainly outgrown her initial stance as sort of a haughty farm girl or a milkmaid. I'm not sure it is tantamount to some of the kind of feminist, muscle flexing that we see from characters in literature today. But I still think that the fact that she's able to muster courage under pressure and defy her kidnappers does inform her character a little bit. For me, she goes beyond just a helpless damsel in distress. But this is a question that I don't necessarily have complete ownership of. You, as an individual group of readers, you may have your own opinion about this. So I ask a question here. Is Buttercup more than merely a helpless damsel in distress? And why or why not? That may be an interesting topic for a potential paper. We'll see. Okay. And we're going to wind up our discussion of the first portion of Chapter 5. Obviously, the kidnappers, once they have secured Buttercup, they notice that a boat is following them. And in one of the best lines of either the book or the film, Vizzini says, well, it's probably just a local fisherman out for a midnight, sail in shark-infested waters. And as he speaks, he becomes less and less convinced of his bravado. And I thought that was just a beautiful moment, both in the text and in the film adaptation. But they quickly discern that it doesn't matter if there is a boat in pursuit of them, because they are soon to reach the cliffs of insanity. And one last little note here, for you film buffs especially, these are real cliffs that you see in the film adaptation. They're as you can see here, Ireland's cliffs of Moher, and the crew actually climbed them. The actors actually climbed them, including Wallace Shawn, who played Vizzini, and he was comforted by the great powerhouse Andre the Giant. He held on to them. He held Robin Wright Penn, and he held Wallace Shawn, and he actually climbed those cliffs. So that's a little fun anecdote that you can share with your friends the next time, or loved ones, when you're watching The Princess Bride. Okay, that brings us to a conclusion for the lecture for today. For next Tuesday, please read the following portion from Chapter 5, which is entitled Inigo. Obviously, we're going to get the backstory of Inigo Montoya, sort of secondary or tertiary hero of the piece. And of course, as promised, I wanted to issue one final reminder that the draft of the ad analysis will be due on or before 11:59 p.m. This Friday. I hope you're enjoying the first few days of October. I know I am, despite the increase in the chilly weather. But I did want to also cap things off by answering a couple of specific questions that people had raised in relationship to that first assignment, the ad analysis. So again, the ad analysis does not require citations. That was one question that I wanted to make sure I addressed. And secondly, I know a number of you had some slight difficulties securing a peer review partner, and you rose to the occasion wonderfully. You just used my commentary and responded to the way that I had answered, or I had addressed issues relating to your essays. Perfect. That's exactly what I would have asked you to have done had you reached out to me. And many of you did, and that is the advice I offered. By contrast, though, I'm going to admit that I've had some trouble making this process of peer review work in the online courses. I don't know why it's proven to be so difficult, but I had difficulty beginning this summer. And a couple of my other courses have expressed, students in my other courses have expressed the same sorts of frustrations. I tried listing all the papers and letting students select, a paper of their choosing anonymously. And what happened is that I ended up with like 4 peer reviews for one student, and then I had several other students who didn't get a peer review at all. So that didn't work. I thought using the forums might be a good way to post a discussion, and then everybody would have to respond. I also thought encouraging students to select the class list option would be a good choice too, because this isn't high school. You should be able to select a peer review partner of your own choosing. I did when I was in college, but the fact that some people might feel cheated or left out of the peer review process obviously means that there's a breakdown in what our true intentions were supposed to be. So I would, whoa, we went out of focus there. I would just suggest that if you have an idea, or if you've done peer review in another class on an online forum like this one that has worked successfully, maybe send me an email or float me a side comment in this week's discussion questions so that I will be able to get a chance to respond or ponder some of those methodologies for our next peer review opportunity. Okay, that's it for me for today. Thanks so much for your time and attention. Again, papers coming up due here next Friday, but until then, I will be available. Until then, I'll be available vis-a-vis email, and I look forward to hearing from you next week. Thanks so much for your time and attention. This is Mr. Fowler signing off.